Hello, class. This is the first part of case study number 1, which is titled Sediment Losses and Gains in the San Francisco Bay Delta. Now, starting with this first case study, we're going to begin exploring particular environmental problems that will involve understanding multiple environmental concepts and principles. To get us started, consider this challenge statement. Environmental problems affect people in the Bay Area pretty equally. So would you agree or disagree with this statement? Before we begin, I'd like you to try to provide some specific examples of how environmental problems affect people either proportionately or disproportionately in the Bay Area. Let's start out with the story of a real event in the Bay Area's history. So here we can see some aerial views of the San Francisco Bay. And you can see that the shape of the bay has been changing dramatically over the past 160 years. Notice there starts to get this buildup of this white stuff along the edges of the bay. So what is all this white stuff? The short answer is mud. Well, you can probably guess that this mud is a normal part of San Francisco Bay. If you think about ocean waters or bay waters, there's often mud in that system, but there's a lot more than normal in the San Francisco Bay, and we're going to learn why over the course of this case study. So with all of this mud, actually came a lot of environmental problems over the last 100 or so years. First off, an obvious change to the San Francisco Bay was a decrease in depth. As it filled up with mud in the San Francisco Bay and the bottom of the bay creeped up higher and higher, it ultimately led to this decreased depth. While we don't know the average depth of the San Francisco Bay in the mid-19th century, we do know much more about it today. The average depth of the San Francisco Bay nowadays is about 8 to 12 feet deep based on high and low tides. And this is kind of amazing when you think about it. You look out to the San Francisco Bay and you see ships cruising through, but while they are cruising in almost 100 feet of water, the average depth is only 8 to 12. Now, this decreased depth does have an unexpected consequence. By having less water, we have less aquatic habitat, and we also have an adjusted photic zone, which is the place where light can reach life in the water. Now, another big change was the destruction of wetland habitats. As we start to get fewer wetlands, as they get covered up with mud and become mudflats, it ultimately leads to less biodiversity, which takes us to the third, loss of species. As we lose species, it becomes a problem for the balance of the system. Also, with fewer wetlands, now there's no places for migratory birds to build their nests. There are fewer aquatic animals because we have less light that can come into our muddy bay. So all of these are consequences of adding all of this mud to our San Francisco Bay system. This is a map that shows us some of the decrease of our wetland areas over the last several decades. And overall, this map shows us that wetland areas have decreased by 90% over basically the last 160 years. So we've got lots and lots of mud, and with that mud came a slew of environmental problems, and they actually continue to affect us even today. So the million-dollar question is, what happened? I'd like you to take a moment and pause to think about this. What different events might have led to all of this mud coming into the San Francisco Bay? So, before we address this question, we're going to start to learn some of the science that will allow us to understand where this mud came from. And to get us started for that science, we need to know a little bit more about the unique history of the Bay Area. Remember, for all of our case studies, we'll focus on first posing the problem, then learning the science, and finally proposing solutions. In order to understand what happened and the significance of the Bay, all three of these conditions must be met. First off, let's define the term ecology, which means the study of organisms and their environment. The focus of ecology is to understand organisms as they live in a specific place. So if we're looking at San Francisco Bay as a system, we want to think about the animals, the plants, the algae, the insects, the birds, all of these different things that we find in our bay system. We can look at different levels of organization. First off, we might look at organismal ecology. That's the study of a single type of organism. Population ecology is the study of a group of species living in the same place at the same time. Community ecology is the study of multiple groups of species living in the same place at the same time. Ecosystem ecology is the study of organisms and their living and non-living environment. And we're going to really focus on ecosystems and landscape ecology for the rest of our lecture today. Now, while we often think of ecosystems as being these big things on our planet, they can be very large. Ecosystems are relative. They can be as small as a tiny puddle or as large as the entire Earth itself. So now we're going to examine how organisms interact with other living things in the San Francisco Bay. And when living things interact with other living things, we call this biotic interactions. The different organisms that are interacting with each other are considered factors. As our first example, let's consider the Asian clam. There's a picture of an Asian clam in the center of the screen. It is an example of an invasive species that feeds very heavily on plankton in the San Francisco Bay Delta. Now, when the Asian clam was first introduced, the native oyster, which is in the bottom left corner, began to decline because of a reduced availability of food. And these are filter feeders, so what they eat is plankton, these little microscopic organisms that are found in the water. Plankton are mostly microscopic, and they resemble what you might call a plant or an animal, but they don't belong to either of those groups. Instead, they are their own unique type of organism. Now, we find them in both freshwater and saltwater systems. Sediment will influence these biotic interactions as these different organisms are living among each other, both invasive and native species in the San Francisco Bay. So the biotic components of any ecosystem could include the producers, the consumers, and the things that eat those consumers. So secondary, tertiary, and other levels of consumers. Filter feeders, such as mussels and clams, get food by filtering water through their bodies, and this makes them especially vulnerable to the presence of sediment and contaminants that are contained in that sediment. Sediment affects other biotic components of the bay ecosystem as well. These bay animals get subjected to sediment and then sometimes have unexpected consequences. For example, some of these species require clear water in order to locate their prey. if the water gets murky from all of this mud and sediment, then they will not be able to find their food. And this can in fact risk upsetting the balance of these ecosystems and disrupting these predator-prey relationships. Sediment itself is actually an example of an abiotic factor. Notice the root word a before biotic. That means not biotic. Other examples besides sediment include sunlight, water, temperature, rocks and soil, wind, or chemical contaminants. These abiotic factors vary in the environment and determine the types and numbers of organisms that exist in the environment. In fact, these non-living physical and chemical factors can in fact determine the ability of organisms to both survive and reproduce. So I'd like you to pause for a moment and do a brainstorming activity. We are going to look at a series of different types of ecosystems, and we are going to try to brainstorm the abiotic factors for that system. In addition, I would like you to try to come up with the limiting factor. And these limiting factors are very important in our study of ecology and environmental science. These limiting factors determine the types and numbers of organisms that live in a given ecosystem. Many limiting factors actually restrict the growth of populations in nature. An example of this would be the warm temperature in the San Francisco Bay, which results in an absence of cold water fish populations. So here's our first system to consider, a tropical rainforest in Costa Rica. So pause the lecture now, and I want you to write down a few ideas. What do you think the limiting abiotic factors are? Okay, so now we're going to give you the answer. I think some of the most important limiting abiotic factors in a rainforest are light and humidity. Now, light is because all of these plants are growing so huge that they start to shade out the plants below them. And if plants can't get light, they can't do photosynthesis, and then they can't survive. Also, humidity. With constant rain and constant moisture, plants and animals have to be able to thrive in very damp and wet conditions. All right, so now you got the hang of this. Let's try another one. What about a temperate desert in the United States? We have deserts like this in Southern California or down in places like Sedona, Arizona. Pause the lecture now and consider some abiotic factors. Okay, so I'm going to reveal the answers now. I believe that water and temperature are the number 2 abiotic factors that limit this system. Organisms have to be able to survive long periods of drought with very little water, and they have to be able to withstand dramatic temperature changes, both very hot and freezing cold, and therefore they must have adaptations to survive. Now for animals, most of them are actually nocturnal in the desert. They only come out at night because it's simply too warm and there's not enough water to tolerate a lot of life during the day. Okay, let's do another one. What about this? An estuary. For example, the San Francisco Bay in the United States is an example of an estuary. Well, the limiting factors for any estuary is going to be salt, temperature, and water content. Remember the sediment that we've been talking about? If there's sediment in the water, that will absolutely be a limiting factor. Up until now, whoever could tolerate the sediment has survived in the San Francisco Bay. However, as water conditions change over the next generations to come, the limiting factors might shift in a different way. So the San Francisco Bay, as we've just mentioned, is an estuary. And an estuary is defined as containing brackish water. And brackish water is a mix of fresh water and salt water. Another important part of the estuary definition is that it must be semi-enclosed. And so we have salt water coming in from the Pacific Ocean under the Golden Gate Bridge, and fresh water is running down from the Sierra Nevada mountain range into the San Francisco Bay Delta by the Sacramento River. The San Francisco Bay Estuary is actually the largest estuary on the entire west coast of the United States. Now, inside of the San Francisco Bay is a very complex food web. And when we're talking about organisms in a food web, we can refer to their trophic level. A trophic level of an organism is the position that it occupies on this food web. And by changing the San Francisco Bay chemistry, by adding sediment to the estuary and changing the photic zones, it can actually impact the plankton, which can completely throw off the balance of this entire food web. Just by changing one organism can throw off the balance of everything else. And it's this sediment that really starts to contribute to this lack of photosynthesis because there is not enough light. So what have we learned from this lecture about the bay ecology? First off, the bay ecology involves studying both the living and the non-living components of the bay ecosystem. Organisms in the San Francisco Bay have very complex interactions with each other and with abiotic factors as well. And given the complexity of these interactions, just small changes can lead to unpredicted consequences. And this illustrates what we call the principle of environmental unity, in which one change will likely affect many organisms and their biotic and abiotic interactions. As a final thought question, I want you to consider this statement. Organisms in the San Francisco Bay mostly interact with biotic factors. Based upon what we've learned, would you agree or disagree, and why? Most importantly, cite specific evidence that you have learned from this video lecture. All right, that's all I have for our first part of Case Study 1. Please email me anytime you have a question, and thank you very much for listening.